If you like Assassin's Creed, you may have seen this meme sometime over the last few years. Apparently, some kid on a school trip had played so much Assassin's Creed Brotherhood that he was able to guide his class to where they were supposed to go when his teacher got lost. Seems too good to be true, right? After all, how accurate can a video game map actually be? Well, I decided to put it to the test. This spring, I was able to travel to Florence, the cradle of the European Renaissance. Home to incredible art, artists, and architecture, Florence is a must-see for anyone who travels to Europe. But more important than Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci is Assassin's Creed 2, the greatest artistic creation since Don't Stop Believing. But instead of Detroit, much of Ezio Auditore's life takes place in Florence. So today, we're going to compare the historical Florence that Ezio inhabited through the late 1400s, as well as the nearby city of San Gimignano, which he visits. We'll look at the histories of these cities, their major figures and structures, and answer the question of if you can navigate a city from an Assassin's Creed map. But first, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and thank you for watching. So first things first, let's quickly look at the history of Florence and San Gimignano leading to the time period of Ezio's Assassin's Creed 2. Both of these cities were minor during the Roman period, with San Gimignano, previously called Silvia, being founded by the Etruscans, another Italian society, in the 200s BC, and Florence being founded in 59 BC by the Roman Republic as a settlement for veterans. Silvia would eventually get its modern name in the 400s AD, when the hill town was allegedly saved by the Christian saint Geminanius, I'm sure I said that right, who summoned a thick fog, preventing the invading Huns from attacking. If you want to learn more about the Hunnic invasion of Rome, I have a video about it right here. So after the Romans fell, Italy was a patchwork with various groups controlling the peninsula. Most of Italy was carved up between Germanic barbarian groups over the years, including the Lombards and the Ostrogoths, while the area of Rome proper stayed part of the Byzantine Empire. This area would eventually become the Papal States, an entity controlled by the Roman Catholic Church, while large parts of Tuscany, where Florence and San Gimignano are, would come under the control of the Franks, which eventually would become the Holy Roman Empire. At the same time, some cities in Italy became powerful trade centers, first Venice, and then Milan and Pisa, among many others. This is all an oversimplification, but just know that by the time we get to the Middle Ages, there are three main types of factions: the Church in the Papal States, the Holy Roman Empire and the ruling family of the Habsburgs, and the independent or autonomous city-states, which often acted as their own countries. But sometimes these groups would team up or get conquered or split apart. Again, this is just a quick rundown, and I get into it a little more in my video on Cesare Borgia, so feel free to check that out if you're interested. So back to Florence. Florence started to get rich because of its textile trade, and a relatively representative form of government began to emerge, where merchants and the middle class held office for short terms to the exclusion of the nobles and laborers. This wasn't quite peaceful, however, and factionalism grew, with the system becoming more or less an oligarchy ran by the various economic guilds, like a medieval version of modern political parties. San Gimignano, for its part, also grew wealthy, as it was along a pilgrimage route many Europeans would take to get to Rome. By the 11 and 1200s, Tuscany was a hotbed of conflict, and two major factions, the Guelphs and Ghibellines, fought for control of central Italy, often supported by the Holy Roman Empire and Papal States in a long-running proxy war. Eventually, the Guelphs won out, and they managed to monopolize the banking and tax collecting of the church, massively expanding their wealth. Florence began to rise to the top of the Italian ladder, but in the mid-1300s, the Black Death struck, setting most of Europe back for decades. Florence did manage to take control of San Gimignano during this time, and the two would be part of one political entity until the time of Ezio. Politically, the previous powerful factions of Florence waned, Again, this is all complex and changed with time. This is just an oversimplification, and this led to new banking and mercantile families rising to power, most notably the Medici. The Medici, despite not actually holding public office, were really in charge with immense wealth and papal connections. In much the same way that many believe that corporations actually run the US in a deep state now, the Medici definitively controlled Florence, if technically behind the scenes. Their soft tyranny was not all bad, however, with the family commissioning amazing works of art and architecture, as well as maintaining peace while providing a good standard of living for the citizens of Florence. Under the Medici, the Renaissance of Europe was truly born, and everything from sculpture to architecture and paintings that changed the course of European thought largely started here. So now that we know what's going on in Florence and San Gimignano at the time of Ezio and Assassin's Creed 2, which starts in 1476 and runs until 1499. From here, we won't go too in-depth about the chronology of the city, as the figures and events here deserve their own videos, but we will certainly mention the major events seen in the game and give some background to how they connected to the wider historical context we just went through. Okay, so now for the meat of the video, how does the AC2 map and plot reflect the real history and layout of Florence? Well, let's start by looking at the AC2 map of Florence, of course. Here we see the basic layout of the city, with the Arno River running east to west about a third of the way up the map. In dark gray, we have the major landmarks in the city, which have database entries in the game. So, do these landmarks actually exist? Almost all of them do, or at least have some correlation to the real world. Let's start where the game starts, on the Ponte Vecchio, or Old Bridge. This bridge housed gold merchants during the Renaissance and the buildings running along the main walkway. In the game, we see Ezio confront Vieri de Pazzi in a street fight here, and Ezio suffers the wound that scars his lip. While we don't know if street fights actually happened here, they probably did at some point, we do know that the Pazzi family were powerful bankers that tried to overthrow the Medici hegemony, an event which we will explore more later. Today, the bridge is largely similar, although a walkway goes along the top of one side of the bridge. This walkway, known as the Vasari Corridor, was actually created long after the events of the game in 1565 as a way for the Medici to traverse the city without being assassinated, so it is totally accurate that the corridor is not there in the game. Next, let's move to the opening title sequence of the game, where Ezio and his brother race to the top of a church as the game's signature soundtrack plays. This church is also a real place, the Basilica di Santa Trinita. That being said, this church isn't so impressive compared to its surroundings, and today you can't even see the steeple from the street since the church is surrounded by other buildings. The church itself isn't too impressive by Italian standards, but it is nice and peaceful inside. Moving north, we hit the landmarks that aren't as based in history, although they have some historical inspiration. First is the Palazzo Auditore, where Ezio's family lives at the beginning of the game. The Auditores, of course, did not exist, although a restaurant named after them does exist in Florence, and no, I don't really recommend it. That being said, a sizable villa does stand here today, the Palazzo Strozzi. Like in the game, this was a private palace for a powerful family. However, this family, the Strozzi, were rivals of the Medici, unlike in the game where the Auditores are friends with them. Further construction of the palace only began in 1489, towards the middle of the game, and it wasn't finished until decades later in 1538, long after Assassin's Creed 2. Today, the palace is a museum with more modern exhibitions, and the outside of the building doesn't quite look like the Auditore house. Next is the Casa de Vespucci, or the House of the Vespucci, which we see later in the game in flashbacks. This would have been home to the famous Vespucci family, the patriarch of which, Amerigo, was a famous explorer known for having America named after him. However, the house was not really here, and instead it is actually outside of Florence. The two other semi-fictional locations also have to do with early parts of the game when Ezio developed his skills as an assassin. Leonardo da Vinci's workshop on the map is west of the Duomo, which we'll get to later, but in reality the workshop that da Vinci used is further northeast, directly in between the Duomo and the Palazzo de' Medici. Today it is just commemorated with a plaque, and yes, it does have a courtyard behind it, at least in the modern day. We also have the La Rosa Colta, the brothel where Ezio shelters his surviving family, as well as learning social stealth. This brothel is not thought to have existed, although there is no doubt that brothels did exist in Florence, just perhaps not one by this name in this location. Now, let's get to the other landmarks. First and foremost is the Duomo, more officially known as the Cathedral di Santa Maria del Fiore, or the St. Mary's Cathedral of Florence. This is the main landmark in Florence, both in the time of Ezio as well as today, and it has an amazing story, which we won't get too deep into. Started at the end of the 1200s, the cathedral's construction was halted when the Black Death came to Florence in the 1340s and 50s. By the time that construction was resumed, the signature dome was not able to be completed as the engineers who had originally planned for it had died. This usually happens after a couple hundred years. This was rectified by the Renaissance man Brunelleschi, who constructed the dome in the early 1400s using techniques that are still not understood today. The Duomo is massive and towers over Florence, both in-game and in real life. However, some parts of the cathedral were changed for the game. Since the building is so big, it had to be downsized for the game, which couldn't accommodate its full size given the limited computing power of the day. Most notably, the dome, which is actually the tallest point of the complex, was shortened to be smaller than the accompanying bell tower. Further, in real life there is a circular baptistry building in front of the cathedral, which was removed entirely from the game. The facade of the cathedral is not totally accurate either, although it is accurate that at this time it was only about a third of the way complete. In game we see it's not fully done, but it looks a bit more than a third of the way complete. That being said, the complete portion actually mirrors the modern facade, which is similar but not the same as the historic incomplete one. Inside the building is quite accurate, the choir enclosure is there, which no longer exists, and the dome is not painted like it is today, which is also accurate because that was done after the game. In terms of historic events, the main inconsistency at this place is the assassination attempt on Lorenzo de' Medici by the Pazzi family. In the game, this takes place outside, but in real life it is believed to have happened inside the cathedral in the choir enclosure. After fighting off the assassination, we see Ezio escort Lorenzo north to the Basilica di San Lorenzo. This basilica was commissioned by Lorenzo himself and was only built a few years before the game. It would go on to be the burial place of the Medicis, and we see Ezio escort him to a side courtyard, although today it is surrounded by other buildings, and the courtyard is only accessible through the church itself, which requires a payment to enter. Fun fact, if you try to travel to Florence, you have to pay for pretty much everything. It kinda sucks. A little to the east is the Palazzo de' Medici, the main palace of the family, which, like its rival palace to the south, is now a museum, although in real life it is closer to the basilica. Moving south, we have another cluster of landmarks around the Palazzo del Signora, now more commonly known as the Palazzo Vecchio, or Old Palace. This was the main seat of political power in Florence since the early 1300s, and it has the unique feature of an off-center bell tower. This bell tower was used to house prisoners, which we see in the game when Ezio goes to talk to his father. Later in the game, we see how Ezio hangs Francesco de' Pazzi from the Palazzo. This is also accurate and happened during the Pazzi conspiracy after the failed attempt on Lorenzo's life. In the center of the square in front of the Palazzo is an execution center where Ezio's family and later father Savonarola are put to death. The statue of Perseus is there as well, and is unique historically in that it was the first bronze statue to be cast in one piece, although this was not done until after the game in the mid-1500s. On the south side of the square is the Loggia de' Lanzi, which historically served as a covered place for meetings and public appointments to be held. Today, it houses various works of statuary and is a nice free art museum in Florence. On top is also a terrace that was historically open to the public, but became private during the time of the Medicis, symbolically demonstrating their importance and how they were literally above the official governance and the law. Further on the edges of the map, we have a couple other places to look at. First is the Basilica di Santa Croce. Today, this church houses the tombs of many famous Florentines, including Machiavelli, Galileo, and Michelangelo, but in AC2 it is most well known for being the site of Ezio's first assassination of Uberto Alberti. Fuck. He carries this out in the courtyard adjacent to the basilica during an art show. To the north, we have perhaps the most irrelevant but nonetheless interesting landmark, the Ospedale degli Innocenti, a famous orphanage of Renaissance Italy. This place is also real, and the game accurately portrays its signature blue crests around the outside of the building and general shape. To the west, we have two sites, one of which is no longer around. This extinct square, called the Mercato Vecchio, was a marketplace and was partly covered with a colonnade and was the center of the original Roman city. However, this was destroyed in the 1800s when the city was being restructured. Then we have the Basilica di Santa Maria Novella. Yes, there are two Santa Maria basilicas in Florence, but this one is much smaller. In-game, Novella is the place where Ezio first goes into the underground and listens in on the Templar meeting after being led there by Le Volpe. In the AC2 DLC Bonfire of the Vanities, we get to explore the southern part of Florence across the river, aptly named the Oltrarno district. The last two landmarks are here. One is the Palazzo Pitti, a massive complex that houses Savonarola in the game. However, in real life, Savonarola did not occupy this palace as it was still a private residence. Pitti would only become a seat of power in the 1500s with Cosimo de' Medici. Remember that corridor we talked about earlier? Well, it actually leads to this place all the way from the Palazzo Vecchio. It also has a large garden area behind it, which is accurate in the game. And lastly, we have the San Spirito Church. This church actually doesn't have a database entry in the game despite being a landmark, but it is arguably the most prominent location south of the Arno. Around the periphery of the map are city walls, which once again are relatively accurate and survive in the city to this day, but mostly along the southern bank. In terms of the layout of the city, everything is roughly in the right place. Another interesting thing about Florence is that the real city is actually kind of small, so the scaling down for the game isn't nearly as drastic, and you can easily walk around in the whole city. To make it a bit more accurate in terms of how far the different monuments are to each other, we would put the Medici monuments right next to each other and put those closer to the Duomo, add the baptistry, move Leonardo's workshop, add a couple more blocks between the monuments and the Arno River, and move Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella a bit further out. That being said, it makes sense why these structures are moved around and a bit more spread out, as it would be inconvenient gameplay to have so many monuments right next to each other and then huge dead spaces. There are also some places that get left out of the game which are notable monuments in Florence. Some make sense, like the Chiesa San Salvatore de' Monte, which is a beautiful church on a hill that makes a great sync point, but it is outside of the city walls. But the two most obvious examples are buildings right next to each other, the Bargello and the Badia Fiorento. The latter of these is a monastery and has a relatively tall spire. The Bargello was actually the precursor to the Palazzo Vecchio, and it is shaped quite similarly, so it is understandable why they left this out, so as to avoid confusion with the nearby building. Lastly, there's one more point of this video that I was researching, and at first I thought the game was being totally inaccurate, but come to find out it actually has a good basis and history, and this is regarding the sync points. While some of the sync points in the game are based on the main monuments, most of them are on these generic looking towers that are copy-pasted and recycled over and over. If you go on Google Maps or even walk around the city, you can't see many towers that protrude like this, especially not ones that are really prominent over the city. but as it turns out, in the past, these were extremely common. Unlike more ornate palaces or mansions which we often see in history, the rich and powerful of Florence would actually live in towers, which didn't even have access at street level but required a ladder to enter. This gave protection in the city of frequent revolt and family feuds, but also demonstrated the power and riches of a family by how tall their tower was. Eventually in the 1400s, these towers were so numerous that it was causing problems in the city and blocking all the sunlight on the streets, so many of these were destroyed or cut down over time. Today, you can see the remnants of these towers everywhere, and in the time of Ezio, there were definitely more that were still standing. Even those alcove climbing handholds you see on them are realistic, although they would usually be next to each other instead of different levels, and they wouldn't be all the way up the building usually. Okay, actually finally, we can do a quick overview of San Gimignano. Almost forgot. This town is far smaller than Florence, and on the AC2 map only has 6 landmarks. One of these, the Roman amphitheater, isn't even real, and while Roman ruins exist in Tuscan Italy, there aren't any next to San Gimignano. Continuing from the Florentine towers, San Gimignano is primarily known for its surviving towers, and it is actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site for this reason. In-game, 4 of the city's landmarks are towers. First is the Torre Grossa, the largest tower in the city and home of its governance. It is also part of the old town hall, and it is where we get Antonio Maffei in the game after the Pazzi conspiracy. In the game, it also houses the assassin tomb of Wei Yu. Then we have the Torre Ragnosa, which was the previous site of the city's governance during the 1200s, and at the time of Ezio served as a prison. Not far off are the Torri di Salvucci, twin towers built by a powerful family to try and challenge the tower height law put into place in the city in the 1200s. This law said that all towers had to be shorter than the Rognosa. While the Salvucci family tried to build them taller, they were cut down in size and just had to settle for having 2 towers instead. And further north was the Torre del Diavolo, or the Tower of the Devil. This name comes from the legend that the builder of the tower went on a journey out of town, and when he came back, he found it taller than he had left it. The last landmark, the Basilica di Santa Maria Assunta, yes, another St. Mary's Basilica, is the main church in the town and is not actually a basilica despite its name. It sits on the town square along with the Torre Grossa, and inside it there are amazing frescoes from the Middle Ages, although in-game you cannot enter the church. The only real inconsistency on this map is that the fortress on the northern edge of the city, the Rocca de Montestafoli, is on the highest ground in the city, unlike in-game where it is relatively low, and it is in better condition in the game than it would have been at the time because it was actually abandoned by this point. The small marketplace on the eastern edge of the city where we assassinate Bernardo Baroncelli also doesn't really exist. We also have the city walls, which aren't quite as accurate in terms of shape, but from these ramparts, key events like first entering the city, listening in on the Templar meeting, and killing Vieri all happen. So overall, Assassin's Creed 2 does a great job at portraying historic Florence and San Gimignano. Some scaling down exists, especially with the Duomo complex, but these cities are actually quite small in real life, and it's not that unrealistic compared to other settings. Could you navigate the cities in real life just by playing Assassin's Creed 2? I would actually say yes. San Gimignano is a bit more difficult because many of the towers look the same, and again, the general shape of the city isn't quite right, but still totally doable as long as you remember what the tops of the towers look like and where they are in comparison to the other structures. Florence, I'd say, is pretty darn easy, in large part because everything is pretty close, especially in the center, and most of the high points are unique, at least in their given area. Time elapsed also doesn't make that much of a difference as long as big monuments are still around. After all, these places aren't going to move or look totally different. So long as the game gets it right, you should be all set, especially with the smaller cities like Florence and San Gimignano. So that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.